And I want to talk for a moment about fortitude. I think this is a key virtue to understand who and what we are as a people. And I think when we think about where we are now in our present society, when we consider what is important for us in our own actions, not only understanding what we've inherited from the past, but what we're willing to pass on to our children, we have to think about the issue of fortitude. And I want to take us back to the Greeks, but I want to take us back to the weird Greeks, not to the Greeks that we generally think of as our ancestors. So almost all of us, despite the fact the Athenians kill Socrates, we generally like to think that if we're Greek at all, we're Greek like the Athenians. We don't usually think too much about the Corinthians. We don't think about the Spartans, and yet the Spartans are really important, and especially when it comes to fortitude. So many of you may know one of the greatest moments in Western civilization, really the beginning of Western civilization, was a massive conflict between this huge, using the old-fashioned term Orient, this huge Oriental power, Persia, which was ruled by a god king, and then all of the Greek city-states, about 150 of them, all with different political systems. Corinth was nothing like Thessaly. Thessaly was nothing like Athens. They each had their own political understanding, but what held the Greeks together was a common idea of language and, to a certain extent, religion as well, and their polytheism. But this is what held them together. And when the great god kings of Persia looked to the west, when they looked to what would have been called the Occident, so from the Orient looking to the Occident, when they looked through the Aegean and they saw what was happening in Greece, they were deeply offended by the Greeks. It didn't matter that the Spartans had a dual monarchy. The Spartans believed that they were free. They believed that they were not ruled by a god king, and this greatly upset the Persians. The Persians lived by the rule of a god king, and they believed it was essential that they establish that rule wherever and whenever possible. And so through incredible hubris and arrogance and some mischief making on the part of the Greeks, the Persians decide to go to war against the Greeks. And this is a war that lasts from roughly 500 BC until 479 BC. And during that time, we have three massive invasions by the Persians. But during one of the greatest and last of the invasions, in 480 BC, Xerxes, the great Persian leader, sends a force of almost 100,000 men, plus his navy, to go against the Greeks. The Greeks, of course, get wind of this, and in particular, the man who is leading the Greek charge against this is one of the dual monarchs of Sparta, a man by the name of Leonidas. He has heard from the oracle at Delphi that he is to have some kind of eternal existence. That is, his reputation will continue. Not a physical heaven, but his reputation will continue. And it will either continue as a man regarded as a horrible figure in history, or he will go down with great fame. That is, he will be remembered throughout the ages. And one of our earliest historians, a man by the name of Herodotus, writes about this. And Herodotus, in his history, writes beautifully about the Persian invasion of the Greeks and tries to describe what was going on in the psychology of Xerxes as he saw these Spartans being led by Leonidas with only 300 men and a few allies holding off 100,000 Persians. So just imagine that for a moment. You've got roughly 300 plus Greeks holding off 100,000 battle-hardened Persians. So this is an incredible conflict of civilizations, but it's also a great disparate number in terms of troops, and we would think that the Persians should be able to wipe out the Greeks immediately. But Herodotus, describing the advent of Greek patriotism, writes, Xerxes was not persuaded any the more. 4 whole days he suffered to go by, expecting that the Greeks would simply run away. When, however, he found on the 5th the Greeks had not gone, he thought their firm stand was mere impudence and recklessness, and he grew wroth, and he sent his best troops against the Greeks with orders to take the Greeks alive and bring them to his presence. You can imagine what he's going to do to them if he can capture them and bring them. He's going to torture them, he's going to interrogate them, he's going to try and figure out what is it that drives them. Herodotus continues, Then the Persians rushed forward and they charged the Greeks, but the Persians fell in vast numbers. Others took their places. They took the places of the slain, but they too were beaten off. The Greeks could not be challenged. And though they too suffered terrible losses, they suffered nothing like the Persians. For in this way it became clear to all, but especially to Xerxes, that though he had plenty of soldiers, he had no men. Now I want you to imagine that for a moment. Now granted, Herodotus is a Greek patriot, even though he himself is from the Turkish coast, most likely. We don't actually know a lot about him. But he identified at least with the colonists of Athens, and he thought of himself as somewhat of an Athenian. So here we have Herodotus, who's writing about this, and notice what he says. What distinguishes the Spartans, who would not be the most beloved people of Greece? These were people who not only had their dual monarchy, but they lived in a very martial, militaristic fashion, very different from what many of the other Greeks had lived like. And yet they shared in that idea of Greekness, of Hellas. They shared that. And what does Herodotus tell us? The enemy had no real men, no people who could think for themselves. Every one of them was a slave to their god king. They could not be independent. And Herodotus tells us that even the Spartans, who may be the least freest among the Greeks, have more freedom and understanding of what they're doing than the Persians do. And this accounts for the defeat. Now, ultimately, however, the Persians are successful, and they do take out all 300 of the Spartans. But it's that moment of intense patriotism, that awakening in the Greek spirit that is put forth because of this sacrifice of Leonidas and his men, that what we can really say, and I know this is one of those throwing down the gauntlet moments, but I think it's absolutely true. Western civilization was born at the moment that the last Spartan died. This is where the West really came into existence. And I would ask for you to think about this for a moment in those first 2 points I wanted to make. That number one, from the beginning, we have this desire to find something universal to understand who and what we are, this element of oneness, this element of likeness in the human being. But number two, we also see this desire to put forth the virtues. That is, to believe that through the virtues, we can attain somehow a certain kind of glory or greatness. And in particular, here we have fortitude. So we put together some of the great things of Heraclitus, the idea of this common human person, and then we put together that with Herodotus, this idea that we can defeat those who are trying to challenge us because they don't understand their own freedom. And this leads to my third point. And that is, and I turn back to what we have beautifully here with the Centennial Institute and with Colorado Christian University, we have this notion of these two beautiful things that come together, grace and truth. And I want to try and pull this together and explain how this comes together for understanding what Western civilization is. So if we think about the West, notice I've already given you two examples of sacrifice. One I went over very quickly. The idea of Cicero, and Cicero knowing that he is to be taken out and basically submitting himself at age 69 to the powers that be, hoping, of course, that something will come of this. And we're still talking about Cicero. Here we are over 2,000 years later. We're still talking about him. And certainly when we look at the American founding, there was no figure more beloved by the American founders than Cicero. He was everywhere in the American founding, to the point that when I had the privilege of teaching at the University of Colorado at Boulder, I taught a course basically called Cicero's Founding, where we looked at all of the influences of Rome in particular, Tacitus, Livy, Virgil, and Cicero, those influences on the American founders. One of my favorite of the American founders, a man that I've had the privilege of spending time with, at least intellectually, not physically, but intellectually, a man by the name of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was the very last of the signers of the Declaration to die. He died on November 14th of 1832 at the age of 95, outlived all the other signers of the Declaration. When he was interviewed at the end of his life, asking, at age 94, 95, how do you keep yourself together? You know that all of the men that you brought about this republic with are gone. How do you keep yourself whole in all of this? And he pointed to his bookstand next to his chair, where he had the New Testament and he had On Friendship by Cicero. And he said, well, Cicero and Jesus are my best friends. I talk to them daily and they listen. This is how powerful this image was in the American founding of this Roman founding and these Romans. So I've given you Cicero, but we've also seen that sacrifice with Leonidas. And then we can take it further. The one that should jump out for all of us, who is beyond and above everyone I've mentioned, Jesus Christ. And he's not the only one. We can think of others throughout all of the Western tradition who have given themselves over for what they believe, given themselves over for something greater than themselves. And so I want to pull this together by mentioning a couple of people and also thinking about what this time period is and why I think this time period is much better than we often give it credit for. I'm going to quote from 3 people. All of them I admire greatly. All of them, I think, believe deeply in the idea of grace and truth.